Natural hypertrophy is an enemy of democracy, and I can prove it. Okay, I'm just joking. So natural hypertrophy recently made a video called Democracy is a Scam and I Can Prove It. And my friend and I have been speaking about this for some time, and he felt that I had some interesting things to say, and there are some substantial disagreements that I actually have with him in his video. And I thought it would be useful for me to make this video, set it out there, see if other people agree. Having a varied discourse is like having a varied diet. It's very healthy in my opinion. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to just jump right in. I'm going to talk a little bit about the video, what my disagreements are, and maybe you'll get something out of it. I hope you get something out of it. If you do, please feel free to share this. Let me know what you think. Cool. So basically, I'm going to structure this as a type of critique. The first thing that I'm going to do is I'm going to summarize what his essential argument is. That way you don't have to go and rewatch the whole video. And then I'm going to get into my critique. And this video is probably going to be pretty long. So I'm going to try and leave timestamps in the description. And if you want a full deep dive into his argument, then I would encourage you to go and watch his video. I'll link it in the description below, and yeah, let's just jump right into it. So let me start with a summary, and what I would say is that the core of this argument is basically surrounding a natural implication, right? His essential argument is that democracy tends to devolve into a type of tyranny, and specifically into an authoritarianism. And I'm going to outline the mechanisms by which he argues that. And the core piece of this is that this degradation is grounded in the degeneration of man, and specifically a regression towards the mean that democracy tends to engender, right? And so there's a type of decadence and a type of averaging out that occurs in democracy that preps man for a type of authoritarianism. So when we get to the critique, I'll mention this a little bit more in depth, but I should say at the beginning that I am going to make a very strong distinction, a very strong delineation between the notion of a democracy and the notion of a republic. I'll point to a particular Federalist paper as to why that's the case. We're not going to get into it here. Once we get into the critique part, we'll talk about that some more. But I just want to lay that at the outset, because I think that if one adopts a Nietzschean philosophy and one assumes the premise that democracy is an effective characterization of the social order of modern man, then what natural hypertrophy argues follows very naturally. However, we'll see that the core of my disagreements are really with the premises of the argument and the sort of assumptions that one must make in order to argue for this implication. So I don't think that the implication itself is necessarily wrong. I just think that the premise isn't effectively characteristic of the human experience, and especially the experience of the West. That being said, I would say that our current experience is a far cry from what I think that our ideal really is and what our ideal ought to be. But I'm not going to go too deeply into the notion of our ideal, because I think it will take us too far afield from the video. That being said, it's probably worthwhile for me to make a video at some point on the nature of our ideals, specifically the ideals of the American man. Well, I mean, I am an American, so. And, well, you can see the title of this YouTube channel, so hopefully you'll understand. But it's fine. Anyways, continuing on. The basic premise here is that the underlying social vitality of the collective is contingent upon heroic figures, which are necessarily atypical, but which the social order of democracy specifically discourages, right? So what I mean by this is And what natural hypertrophy argues for is that there's a type of tropical man, those are Nietzsche's words. In other words, this atypical man who rises above the rest, who brings life into society in the sense that, he sort of goes outside the bounds of what the norms are, discovers something fundamentally new, brings it back, and it's a revivifying panacea to the natural decay of the social order. And the hypothesis here is that democracy per se, the underlying psychology that characterizes the facilitation of democracy per se, is discouraging of this type of behavior and necessarily mutes it, necessarily causes it to fade out, right? And so this is the basis of the argument of the regression to the mean that natural hypertrophy puts forward, right? So what I would say is that one can view this as a pair of natural implications, right? So one has, on the one hand, in the psychology of the social ordering that democracy imposes, one has a pair of implications. The first implication is that you have a natural implication from sacred to profane. So in other words, something that's numinous, something that's holy, something that's spiritual, something that's divine, tends to degrade into something that is more earthly, more not malicious, but just lacks its luster, lacks its sheen. It sort of becomes like dirt. It's like seeing gold go to dirt rather than the other way around. And then the other implication in the pair is that you have this natural degradation from this notion of individuality to this notion of collectivization, which the collectivization essentially functions as a homogenization, a sort of smoothing out of regular man. This is what the regression to the mean is, right? So one has this sort of decay into mediocrity where one becomes like everyone else. And I would say that he views that as the basic mechanism that causes everything to fall into place so that one can be primed for a type of authoritarianism. But again, I think that there's something wrong with the premise that that's all that we are, that it's inevitable that we fall into a type of authoritarianism. But again, I'll get to that later. So he begins the whole video with a discussion of the notion of equality, because he views this entire dynamic as contingent upon, or sort of hinging upon, or finding at its very center this notion of equality. Like, if I were to take out the notion of equality, then the whole thing falls apart, democracy can't function, and so on. That being said, I wish that he did a little bit more work to define his notion of democracy. I'm going to assume intuitively that he means one man, one vote, or one person, one vote. But I'll get to that when we come to that. So anyways, he defines this notion of equality as the state of being equal. And specifically, he lists some metrics. He says things like resources, status, outcomes, opportunities, right? And the point that I want to make here is that the notion of equivalence must always be defined in a relational fashion. So, in other words, one must say equal with respect to what, right? So let me put it this way. I can take any two objects, any two physical objects, such as like my water bottle and my phone, or this camera and this piece of paper, anything like this. And I can label both of those things as physical. And in some sense, then those two things are the same, right? Because if I ask the question, well, what is in the set of physical things? And then I say, is this thing physical? Is that thing physical? You say yes to both of those things, right? And I say, well, if this thing is physical and that thing is physical, and that thing is physical and that thing is physical, then this thing and that thing are physical, right? So you have this transitive property. A physical thing is a physical thing. Physical things, the notion of two things being physically the same as both being physical, is a symmetric relation as well. So what I mean here is that I have to introduce this notion of physicality. I have to introduce the notion of a property in order to be able to deduce whether or not two things are the same with respect to that property, right? And so these particular metrics that he introduces have an intuition of materialism to them. Now, I'm not saying that his notion of equality is purely materialistic. It doesn't seem to me to be that's the case. But it does seem to me that one has a materialistic embedding here, right? So one has this notion of equality. One can reduce this notion of equality to a type of materialistic equality and embed that in a theory of materialism. Now, this reduction to a purely materialistic point of view is an oversimplification of the notion of equality. But what I mean to say here is that there is a materialistic aspect to it. And so I would say that because these metrics have a materialistic aspect of them, and because natural hypertrophy makes the observation implicitly that aggregates of humans must be formed in order for these metrics to become relevant. Like, so for example, resources, we don't mean resources in the sense of food and so on, although that's relevant. We mean resources in the sense of economic resources. We mean status with respect to other people. We mean outcomes with respect to other people. We mean opportunities with respect to other people, right? And so in the context of this argument, he's saying that we need to have these aggregates in order for these notions to make sense. And as a consequence of these being the metrics, the intuitive metrics which characterize equality, it must be the case that equality is a socially constructed content. And let me just quote him quickly. Just to really hammer the point home. He says in the first 5 minutes, I didn't write down the exact time, he says in the video, if something needs to be enforced via legal means for it to exist at all, like equality, for example, then it must be a social construct. Okay, so this leaves us with two fundamental questions that we need to answer in this context. The first question is going to be, what precisely is a social construct? And then the second question is equality a social construct per se? In other words, is it impossible for me to exhibit a construction of the notion of equality that is not a social construct? And of course, that's contingent upon the first question being, what is a social construct, right? So if we don't have a precise definition of the idea of a socially constructed content, then we can't answer whether or not equality is a socially constructed content. So briefly, what is a social construct? I write here, I say, it must be a phenomenon which emerges out of a social context which cannot exist or be deduced to have aspects outside of this context. And the individual must experience society as the vector for the phenomenon. So what do I mean by this? I just mean that first of all, one could not realize this content outside of a social setting, and you must be able to exhibit that it cannot possibly exist outside of the social setting. And furthermore, one must experience the social setting itself as the thing that facilitates the experience of the thing in question, right? So let me use a law as an example, okay? When I speak about the notion of a law, of course, we have many aspects to a law. There's the literal phrasing that goes into the legal books. There's the way that, for example, the governmental bodies interpret the law. There's the way that the law gets imposed upon the on the social setting with respect to the individuals in particular, and the way that it shapes society and all of that, right? Now, on that side of things, there's a very pragmatic, sort of practical, sort of physical, sort of phenomenological aspect to the notion of a law, right? There's all of these particular instantiations. Of course, the interpretation, the realization of the law is going to be contingent upon the particular society which writes the law down, right? So we could, for example, have the same law, supposing we have perfect capacity to translate intention and everything. And then we were to translate, well, not intention, but we have perfect capacity to translate insofar as it's faithfully representable of the ideas. Well, even that might undermine it. But anyways, let's suppose that we can translate the law between different languages, and then we give it to a different society. Then one wouldn't necessarily expect the exact same outcomes, right? And so one could say that the way that the law gets sort of injected into the social setting, how the people experience it, and so on, is the socially constructed thing. But that doesn't imply that the initial intuition behind the law is necessarily a social construct, right? Just because one needs society to be able to realize an idea, it does not mean, or make an idea more precise, it doesn't mean that the idea itself is necessarily a consequence of purely social context, right? I think that any sort of big ideas, any sort of transcendental idea, such as God, for example, could not really be deduced to be a socially constructed thing. However, one might say that the experience of God in, say, the context of the Roman Catholic Church is a socially constructed thing. That seems reasonable. But what we're separating here is the thing that comes to us that we try to represent in the physical world and the way the thing is represented in the physical world, for example. So when I form this separation, I would say that the way that the thing gets represented in the physical world is the socially constructed thing, and that's what I'm going to say is a social construct. But the thing that sort of gives rise to this thing need not be socially constructed. In other words, we would have to do a little bit more work to show that that thing is also socially constructed. And furthermore, I think that if one can show that the thing that gives rise to this thing is derived from something other than a socially constructed content, that one cannot say that the motivating factor behind what gives rise to the social construct is itself a social construct. Otherwise, we're in a circle. So then the question comes, is equality a social construct per se? And I'm not going to do this now, I'm going to do this in the second half of the video, but I'm going to try and give a construction which exhibits equality in a setting which is necessarily not socially constructed, in which case I would say this is where our opinions begin to diverge. Yes. So I have some notes on notion of will to power, but I don't want to include them. I'm going to suffice it to say that the idea that the fundamental motivating aspect behind man is strictly will to power, I don't think is exactly the case, because it can't effectively account for, in my opinion, the experience and the phenomenon of mentorship. Because I don't think that, well, let me put it this way. I would say that any experience that I have had of positive mentorship, where I am a mentor, has nothing to do with me. Like, my facilitation of another individual's realization of their self doesn't really have anything to do with me. And so I can't say that I'm imposing my will upon this other individual, or I'm reconstructing his nature in a way that facilitates my own reality. Although, I suppose one could make that argument, but that just doesn't seem to be effectively characteristic of the experience per se. And the particular example I have in mind when Nietzsche is speaking about this notion of will to power is, it's either in the book, The Will to Power, or it's in The Gay Science, I don't remember exactly where he says that there's a need to even reevaluate the structure of physics, right, where on the basis of will to power, where really everything is trying to exert itself upon everything else simultaneously. And the state that we find ourselves in is effectively a type of equilibrium as a consequence of this. It seems to me that that's really missing something fundamental about the experience of reality, of being human, and so on. However, this notion of will to power also sort of implicitly forms a crux of the whole argument. And so I just want to make a mention of this point here too. Okay, so let's get on to his idea about the structure of democracy. So his idea of the structure of democracy with respect to the fundamental social form, or the social organization that democracy imposes, essentially is like, you have nature, and then you have a bound, and no one asks the question of how the bound came to be, but we have a bound, right? And then we have a homogeneous distribution of individuals inside of the bound. So I just have a bunch of people inside the boundary, right? So like, literally think of, like, you're in the forest, we cut down part of the forest, we put up a wall, we put people within the wall, and then they interact with one another, right? And then we introduce the notion of equality, right? And so as a consequence of introducing this notion of equality, we basically have a homogeneous sort of smoothing out of people inside of this wall. So they're protected from the natural structure. Everything is purely realized socially. And this basis of equality means that there isn't really anybody who's above anyone else inside of this society. And as a consequence of that, it's difficult to discern who makes decisions, who guides things, and at the end of the day, what ends up going is basically what the majority wants, right? Yes. So, in some sense, it's characterized by psychology, which cannot effectively understand its own genesis. It just assumes a type of static equilibrium. You know, it always has been, always will be, it is forever, right? It's just this, we're all equal, we all get one vote, we all get one say, and it's always been this way, it will always be this way. There's no reason to have to contend with anything. I mean, we have problems, but, you know, for the most part, everything's basically secure. Yeah. So if you know a little bit of analytical psychology, then, and in particular, if you've read, for example, Neumann's Origins and History of Consciousness, or if you've read his The Great Mother, it's very easy to observe how this construction is essentially a feminine-dominated image, right? There's no question about the erection of this of the border. There's no realization of the sort of sacrifices that needed to go into this structure. There's no hierarchical respect. There's no reverence for the sort of masculine ordering that needed to be adopted in order to impose this structure out of nothing, right? It sort of makes this assumption that this homogeneous sort of collectivization of being has been, will be, is forever. Yes. And furthermore, this notion of equality in particular characterizes the social setting within the circle as if anyone were to try to inject the idea of any type of hierarchy, it would regard this as at best inappropriate and at worst abhorrent, like immoral. This is very characteristic of the nature of feminine psychology. If you read analytical psychology, it's very characteristic of the archetypal contents of the feminine. So essentially, what we have under this argument is a type of feminine-dominated psychology. I might remark here that it seems sort of ironic, I suppose, that Athens would be the first democracy, right? Who is the patron god of Athens? Of course, it's Athena. It's a woman, right? And it's not to say that there's anything inherently wrong with this. I mean, that's not the point. The point isn't that there's anything inherently wrong with the feminine. It's just that this is characteristic of the feminine psychology, right? One can have degradation of feminine psychology just as much as one can have degradation of masculine psychology. Problem is that masculine psychology tends to degrade into hyperstructure, like very rigid structure. Degradation of feminine psychology tends to regress into a sort of pure homogeneity. Yes, and in particular, I cite Beyond Good and Evil, in Beyond Good and Evil 127 here. So if you have a copy of it, you can go look. Yes. So then, so this is the initial picture, right? Is that you sort of have this single sheaf, this single level. But actually, in a democratic structure, you have two levels. You have this single sheaf of social structure, and then underneath it, you have the state. And the state is actually, in some sense, an unconscious representation of the masculine, if, again, we're using analytical psychological terms here. I'm sort of taking your knowledge on that for granted. Talk about that later. So anyways, the state itself facilitates the borders. The state itself facilitates the structure. The state itself sort of preserves everything, right? And it gives a sort of farcical sense to the individuals within the society that they are all equal and that they have a say in the structure of the state and what the state does to preserve this whole order. And of course, this ends up leading natural hypertrophy down a logical path, which is totally reasonable, that that the individuals who end up leading this structure tend to be hypocritical. But I'll get to that. Yeah. Yes, so essentially, so what I say here is, the social setting is continually perpetuated by an underlying state, which functions as the masculine structure, which preserves the separation. The feminine, between nature and society. The feminine principle serves to perpetuate homogeneity. If a child is raised in this homogeneous state, then he is bound to regress towards the average. All greatness is inevitably viewed as antithetical to goodness, right? So you have what it means to be socially acceptable and what it means to be great. And those two things become fundamentally separated because there's this desire to perpetuate absolute equilibrium. And I say, this social order is a natural consequence of the notion of equality set up at the beginning. So therefore we have this natural chain, which goes from equality to democracy to authoritarianism, right? And so this average man, this sort of herd-like man, this sort of man that regresses towards the mean, becomes to be prepped to be subjected to a type of manipulation by this underlying state, because the masculine fundamentally becomes unconscious, right? So as a consequence of the masculine becoming unconscious, he becomes dark, manipulative, has to use other means to impose his will in some sense. And of course, because he's masculine, he has this inherent need for separation, inherent need for hierarchical structure. So there's this sort of inherent contradictoriness, this inherent absurdity of trying to make compatible an absolute homogeneity with this inherent desire to form order in order to preserve the social structure, right? And so that, I think, becomes the basis of the degradation of the system. Yes. Yes, and I'm just repeating myself here. I say the most important consequence of this mediocrity, which this social structure engenders, is the tendency toward obedience as a result. In view of NH, this is in tension with an opposing instinct of command, which I suppose he derives from the will to power. And the mediocrity to which man regresses to under democracy erodes his own individuality and will and replaces it with the collective will. Okay, so now let's get on to this notion of hypocrisy and sort of the structure of the ruling class and so on. Yes, and so what I say here is that his fundamental contention is that the structure of the ruling class is that it's characterized fundamentally by a trait of moral hypocrisy. Then I ask the question, what is the genesis of this, and what is the nature of this hypocrisy, right? And I sort of alluded to this in the discussion, this foregoing discussion, that the hypocrisy is based on incompatibility of rulership together with the notion of equality, right? So it's like you're trying to make compatible this notion that, well, I'm a ruler and everything needs to be perfectly the same, which of course is absurd on the face of it, because if everything needs to be perfectly the same, then no individual has any say more than any other individual. And as a consequence, the only real way one could make decisions in a perfectly collective structure is the individual says, I have an idea. Then they lay it on the table. Then everybody gathers around the idea. They all vote on the idea. And every time someone has an idea, that's what needs to happen, right? And so there is no, like, I can elect somebody to represent myself. But of course, this is absurd. One can't possibly do exactly this. Every decision can't be voted on by literally everybody because we just have too many people. Although I suppose hypothetically with technology one could make this happen, but again, this is just not a good idea for reasons that I'll get into during the critique. Yes, and I say here something. So I would say there are two types of psychology that characterize a man in such a leadership position, right? The first could be that he's feckless, in which case he's incapable of making decisions at all, right? And so he can only ever think like, well, I have an idea, but I have to make everything homogeneous. So the only way to have that idea is literally everybody vote on it. If we can't have everybody vote on it, then I'm paralyzed. I can't do anything, right? So he's useless. The other type of man, of course, is much more nefarious and more manipulative. He doesn't view himself as owing anything to the group, right? And as a consequence, he tries to impose his will in a sort of backhanded sense. And so necessarily he's more antisocial, he's necessarily more psychopathic, necessarily more narcissistic, necessarily more Machiavellian. But these two types of psychology and the underlying social structure make an assumption which I tend to disagree with. And I say this, this consequence only holds if the person placed in power regards it as his right to impose his will and not his sacred duty to represent the will of those he stands for. Without this, there is hypocrisy, right? So if one who is elected as a leader does not view it as his duty to effectively represent the ideas of those who put him in power, because he has a respect for a particular type of equivalence that men share, then of course there is a type of moral hypocrisy that follows. It's a very natural type of moral hypocrisy. And I think that natural hypertrophy is exactly on point with respect to this contention. But again, I think that it neglects a type of equivalence, which I will come to, that I think undermines this disposition. And again, this is the basis of why I think there needs to be a very, very strong distinction between the idea of a democracy and a republic. And also, I don't think that the basis of this degradation is inherent to the social order. But we're almost there. Okay. So then I just summarize everything. Let me see here. Well, I'll just read it. So I say here, the social order is homogenized on the principle of equality. The state farcically represents the homogenized body, builds policy to engender compliance and ambivalence. Mediocrity is the natural outcome. Man has no incentive towards growth, and all ideals are stamped out, since they build fervor. The state preserves the boundaries, thus the safety of the inner social order. Thus one has shepherds and the herd. The herd is gaslit into believing it can choose its shepherd. All shepherds are effectively in collusion and abuse the sheep. Any deviation from this is viewed as immoral. The governmental and social structures are imposed to maintain their disposition. From the individual embedded in the social order, it is essential to the preservation of this that he believes in a projective equivalence, in other words, natural type of equality among men, but whose metric is effectively material, which he must experience as equivalence among men. Yes, of course, I just said that. He either cannot perceive the injustice among the elites, or he must be so compliant that it simply does not matter any longer. The natural result of authoritarianism on the basis of this compliance becomes obvious when the man who knows how to leverage both the compliance and perceived hypocrisy turns the herd against the abusive masters. This is the basis of, for example, revolution. Okay. So that lays the groundwork for essentially what the argument is. But now let's turn to the other point of view. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to try and offer up an alternative point of view, which I think is based around a different type of equality, a different notion of equality, a very American notion of equality, which I think undermines not this implication. Again, I think that all the conclusions follow very naturally from the premises, but I think what it undermines is the hypothesis that the premises effectively characterize our current state of being. I think that there are other aspects of being human that we can leverage that don't mean we have to devolve into pure individualism, and also don't mean that we have to devolve into authoritarianism. And in fact, I think that if one chooses to go the strictly individualist route and feels no obligation towards the collective whatsoever, towards the individuals who share his identity and so on, then the authoritarianism which one deduces to follow will follow inevitably. But again, I think that it's only on the basis of this. It's a type of neglect of responsibility, I think, which we conclude on the basis of this type of equivalence, which I'm going to argue for now. Okay, so again, I'm going to leverage some more tools from analytical psychology, and well, I suppose at some point I should make a video regarding which resources are the most important and what the core concepts are, but you should be able to pick up what I'm saying as we go along. I will try to leverage your intuitive idea of what these things are, and I'll explain sort of what the technical concepts are as we go through this. All right. So the first thing that I want to argue is that the degradation that gets represented in this natural implication of democracy to authoritarianism is actually something much more fundamental, and that this is just a social representation of something that's actually inherent to man. And so it's not, I wouldn't say that it's the notion of equality per se, but it's actually the pathologization by means of this degradation of the notion of equality, which gives rise to this implication. And so I think that the basis of the stance against this degradation actually comes from a deeper level. It actually comes from, I think, a type of moral self-awareness and a moral type of action that one must take in order to, I suppose, prevent this degradation. And furthermore, I'm going to argue that democracy isn't the right way to realize an appropriate government of the people anyways. And all of this is going to give rise to the idea of equality that's actually a type of transcendental equality, a type of equality that we derive a priori among men, which does not get represented as materialistic equality, and that any sort of materialistic equality is an absurd representation of this equivalence. Okay. Yes, and I say here, in my view, a republic is the only form of government which can adequately take into account consciously the a priori equivalence of men before a transcendental content. The best monarchies do this, but its conscious realization is contingent upon the monarch being sufficiently divine. In a republic, this fact can be encoded in a decentralized manner. A republic, not a democracy, can be constructed as to attempt to build a social order which balances both the necessary hierarchical and egalitarian elements to a healthy, functioning society. Okay. So first, let's talk about this notion of a shadow, because it's going to form the basis of the whole argument with respect to this degradation. What I'm hoping to show is that this degradation actually emerges naturally as a consequence of a type of repression that human beings leverage as a consequence of trying to deal with their darker nature, or suppression. So in analytical psychology, the shadow is a function. And in particular, so you have a man, he has a psyche. In other words, he has a mind. I mean, the mind and the psyche aren't the same thing, but whatever. You can think about those things as the same thing. So he has a mind. The mind has a structure to it. And there's a bunch of stuff that's in the mind that the human doesn't like. All the things that the man doesn't like about himself, all the things that the man sees in other people, that he disdains about them, all of these aspects, all of these sort of evil aspects, all of these aspects that he shuns are all facilitated with this notion of a shadow. And so what I say here is that it's a compensating function to the identity with which the ego associates, right? So you are a person, you have an idea about who you are, and then there's a bunch of stuff that you say, that's not me. I don't like that. That's evil. That's wrong. That's improper. That's immoral. I shouldn't do that. Da 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 da. All of these thoughts, right? All of those things are associated with your shadow, right? So in other words, there's a real part of your psyche that represents all of those things to you, and you say, well, I'm different than that, right? And so then that thing goes into the unconscious. The thing becomes unconscious because you say, I am not that. So these things can't be associated with who you are. They have to be associated with something else. And by virtue of these things being associated with something else, they end up being repressed, suppressed, and so on. I strongly recommend Jung's Introduction to Complex Theory here. If you read Collected Works 8, it's in there. I forget exactly the title of the essay, but it has something like Complex Theory in the title. You can find it. Also, his theory on psychic energy in that same volume is particularly useful to help understand what I mean by these things. Okay. So, for example, Neumann writes in Origins and History of Consciousness, the shadow contains all those elements in the personality which the ego condemns as negative values. This selective valuation is collectively determined by the class of values current in the individual's cultural canon, right? So your society, your culture has a part to play in saying what you should and shouldn't do, right? So for example, if we think before 1920s or something like that, it was improper for women to show their ankles, and then it was improper for women to show their legs, and so on, right? All of these sort of negative valuations are associated with the shadow. And in this particular example, there's a type of sexual suppression that was going on, which helps explain why Freud has his idea about sexuality as the basis of the psyche and so on, because it was one of the fundamentally suppressed and repressed natural functions of man. Of course, now we're realizing a compensation for that, which is sort of swinging out of control, in my opinion, but that's a different story. This quote that I gave was on page 351. If you want, you can go and look it up, and you can read the whole thing, the whole blurb that comes after it. It's a good summary of how the shadow works. Yeah. If we think about this shadow as a legitimate dynamical content in the psyche, in other words, it guides how you act, or it acts upon you in some sense, we can say this. As an action, therefore, it serves as a content to be projected or identified with. If we view mediocrity, for example, as a negative value, we must ask, how is it that men came to be okay with this? How did they come to be okay with being mediocre, right? If it's something that's inherently negative. Now, I just said that it's socially determined. I'm not saying that the totality of negative values are socially determined. I'm saying that social determination has a part to play in this, okay? I think that it's intuitively clear that mediocrity is a negative value, especially if you're a man. And so one must ask the question, why is it men can feel like, hey, it's okay for me to be mediocre? Yes, and I say here, Nietzsche views it as a decadence and as a sunsetting of one's will to life and a related will to power. And this is what NH refers to as the command function, for example. Yes, and in Will to Power, in section aphorism 345, he says this: the basic tendency of the weak and mediocre of all ages is to weaken and pull down the stronger, right? And so in some, like I said, it's a compensating function, right? It takes what's high and brings it low. Yes, and I say here, that is, one observes a natural dissolution of the strong in the weak, which is to say, a gradual lengthening of one's shadow as he strives ever higher. One must ask, how do families or castes or species of men succumb to this slow degradation? NH argues that democracy in itself, on the basis of a naive equality, is the vector for this action. But here, it would seem that this tendency is actually far more fundamental. It would seem our current age and current politic is merely succumbing again to this action, this decadence. One might argue that more rigid caste structure naturally yields a more living social order. But to do this is evidently at the expense of this transcendental equality, which I will discuss, and which we intend to maintain. On the other hand, this notion of equality does not dissolve capacity to form hierarchies. This transcendental notion of equality, not the previous definition of equality, which does preclude those things. Rather, it implies that the hierarchies are to form on the basis of one's talents, but that each man, in proportion to what he is given, ought to produce that which he can. No man is more or less righteous on these grounds, but for a man who is only capable of producing 2 talents, thinking he deserves 4, well, such a man is not righteous. And so, of course, I cite the Bible here, and you can go and look it up, Matthew 21 to 16. So, what am I trying to say here? I'm trying to say that we will argue for the notion of equivalence in such a setting that this decadence and this degradation is actually inherent to us, and that it is our sacred duty to produce what we can with respect to what we've been given. This is like making the best of the hand you've been given, you know? The problem comes into play when one starts to believe that he's worth more than what he actually is, right? This notion of equality that I'm going to set up does not negate capacity to form hierarchies. If we take equality, specifically equal outcomes and equal status and so on, as materialistic metrics of what it means to be equal, then these things are precluded, particularly hierarchies are precluded. But if instead we define equality in a different fashion, in a transcendental fashion, which I'm going to discuss, then that contradiction no longer persists. The problem, again, comes when a man starts to believe he's entitled to more than he actually is. But that sense of entitlement, that sense of I deserve more, comes from an identification with the shadow, comes from an inherent degradation, comes from the action of this fundamental psychological structure that is embedded in all of us, right? Where one starts to believe, fuck you, fuck everything, screw this, screw that, go to hell, blah, 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 all of that stuff, right? One starts to think those sorts of things. And when one starts to think those sorts of things, one is taken to a very dark place. And that dark place forms the basis of a type of resentment, which becomes consuming. Okay, so I've been talking about equality as a transcendental phenomenon, so let me clarify this even farther. So, I say here, equality as a foundational concept for contemporary Western culture, in particular American culture, is derived from a transcendental principle. And what I mean by that is, one begins with the idea of the notion of God, for example, and then derives the idea that all men are equal on the basis of the fact that God himself is the property by which we are to compare ourselves to one another, or really the Holy Spirit, on the basis of John 14, by the way. So I quote here from the Declaration of Independence just to really hammer this point home. The beginning, the prelude to the Declaration of Independence says this: when in the course of human events it becomes necessary for one people to dissolve the political bands which have connected them with another, and to assume among the powers of the earth the separate and equal station to which the laws of nature and nature's God entitle them, We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights, that to secure these rights, governments are instituted among men, deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed. So it's very clear in this passage that this notion of equality, which forms the basis of the modern republic, the basis of the modern American republic, is derived from this idea that we are all equal before God. And this is the same thing to say as we are all equal before the law. But when I say we are all equal before the law, what I mean is we are all equal before the capital L law. Not the things that we write down on the pieces of paper, but in some sense, we are all subjected to the same laws of physics. And it's much clearer how those things are transcendental principles than, whatever sort of arbitrary thing some random person decides to write on a piece of paper that day and then say everybody's subjected to this thing, right? Like if I hold up two things that have mass and I let them go and we're on Earth, they're always going to fall down. That's just like a immutable truth of being, right? And so in some sense, the question is, well, so what is the scope of these immutable truths? Like maybe there are these immutable truths which also characterize interactions among men, right? And if that's true, then there is a type of equivalence that men share, which has nothing to do with society, but has everything to do with the fact that each man is derived from a transcendental principle. This thing cannot find itself as emergent from a social context. It expresses itself in a social context, but it is something which you come equipped with by virtue of your being, by virtue of being man, right? So in this sense, we're talking about an a priori equality. We're talking about something which comes prior to the formation of a social structure. And I think that it's actually the degradation, the pathologization, the sort of losing sight of this particular type of equality, which forms the basis of the implication that NH argues for. Yes, and I say here, the naive equality which we obtain in the NH video is a pathologization or corruption of this transcendental equality. The dissolution of hierarchy leads to democracy. No republic would be so constructed. Yes, in other words, if one sets up this notion of naive equality, then one has no notion of, for example, aristocracy. And in order to really hammer this point home, in order to show that the psychology of the men who set up this idea of equality that I just argued for did not regard this naive type of equality as the type of equality they were talking about, can be exhibited in this particular letter that Thomas Jefferson writes to John Adams on October 28, 1813. He says this: "There's a natural aristocracy among men. The grounds of this are virtue and talents. There is also an artificial aristocracy founded on wealth and birth, without either virtue or talents. The natural aristocracy I consider the most precious gift of nature for the instruction, the trust, and government of society." Right. So one observes a very natural type of hierarchy. Right. This is Jordan Peterson goes on and on about, say, for example, the Pareto principle and the tendency of wealth to accumulate. Right. And also this is exhibited in the Bible, for example, in the parable of the talents, where the man who makes 10 talents ends up getting the talent of the guy who doesn't do anything with his one talent. So in the structure of a republic, where transcendental equivalence forms the basis of the society, there is a natural aristocracy, but these men, by virtue of the way they conduct themselves, they view it as their duty to effectively do right by their people, to represent their people, like they owe something to their people, because they observe that what those men have done is they have taken a little bit of that transcendental equality, that inherent power divested from God into them, and they have given it up. They've given up a little bit to this one individual who is off to represent them. it's not a type of manipulation. It's not a type of I'm going to do what the hell I want with this power. No, it's very much like I am obligated because of my station, because of my nobility, because of my aristocratic nature. I'm obligated to do right by these people. And I think Nietzsche even speaks about this in Beyond Good and Evil in the section What is Noble. I mean, he comes at it from a slightly different angle, but I would say that implicit in his argument there is also this sensation. I mean, there is an aspect to it of I'm the noble, so I'm allowed to do what I want, but there is also this aspect of it which is very much like I realize that I'm above these people. And I can do heinous things with that realization, or I can do things which I regard as virtuous with that realization. So then I say here, this equality which laid the foundation for the American Republic was never intended in the naive sense. This is made obvious even further in Matthew 25:14-30, and especially in Matthew 25:28-30. Democracy per se is a pathologization of the American model. The degree to which So I'm taking a slight dig at NH here. I say the degree to which the French and all other European democracies are based on the American model is the degree to which this remains true. If you compare Federalist Paper number 10, this is where James Madison is very concerned with arguing against the passions of the people. I'm paraphrasing, but essentially he says that there are two types of passions that give rise to factions. And the first type of passion is a type of centralization of power, and the other type of passion is the passion of the people. And so one of his major concerns is resisting the will of the masses, right? And of course, this is easily exhibited in thought experiments on the basis of like, well, if you have a 60-40 split and 60% want to kill 40% because the 40% have been projected with scapegoat, then, in other words, they've come to bear the shadow of the 60%. Then, of course, in a natural democracy, what's going to happen? Those people are going to get brutally murdered. But in a republic, in principle, there are supposed to be checks and balances. There's supposed to be structures in order to allow for a peaceable existence of these two things, in order to resist or hedge against this shadow projection, so that even in the case that the shadow projection occurs, the society is still able to function, right? So this is the notion of factions, of course, is if you have multiple competing factions, what you want to do is have a structure so that in the case that factions emerge, which it seems they have, when one faction comes to bear the shadow projection of the other faction and vice versa. We do not want it to devolve into, for example, civil war. So one cannot say that our aim was a democratic system or a pure democracy if such considerations are being taken into account. Really, it seems that one wants to say, no, the people have their just say. They need to have a voice. They need to feel represented. They need to feel as though they have a place at the table of the nobility. But society itself isn't constituent of strictly the equal people. I mean, there is a transcendental equivalence. It doesn't mean that the nobles don't have a type of fundamental respect for the peasants and so on. But it also doesn't mean that we dissolve this notion of hierarchy. Yes. The aim of the social order in this view is not a regression to the mean, but to withdraw from every individual all that he is capable of. Most men are not capable of great feats, but this does not imply, one, that they cannot be capable of something, and two, that their voice ought to be so diminished as to have no input into the state of affairs in which they participate. If one acknowledges that they have a fundamental type of equivalence to you, then it's necessary to hear what they have to say. It doesn't mean that they are the best individual to represent themselves in the context of an aggregate. You see, in principle, the virtuous, the natural nobility, the natural aristocracy are the ones who are to be elected. Now, of course, this is idealistic, and I freely admit that that's the case. But if we're trying to understand the underlying psychology which gave rise to the system to begin with, one cannot be so cynical as to say, well, it was a pure democracy, it intended to engender mediocrity, the state is supposed to facilitate a type of herd-like structure on the basis of a moral hypocrisy, and so on. Yeah, but that's not the basis of the theory, right? If anything, that's a pathologization. Now, one could argue that pathologization is a natural pathologization. It's always inevitable. It's going to occur. But one cannot say that there weren't these other motivating ideas, that there weren't these other, psychological contents that form the basis of these thoughts. And then one would have to go farther and ask the question, well, why would anyone think these things to begin with? Right? Because to what benefit is it what benefit is it to me that you should realize all that you are in some sense if it will never truly impact me? I mean, if we are living in a purely materialistic point of view, right? I think from a spiritual point of view, for example, it's completely obvious why I would want you to realize all that you are. One only has to listen to Jordan Peterson for maybe 5 minutes to realize why it's reasonable to have such a thought. I mean, or one can go and read a bunch of things but whatever, it doesn't matter. Yeah, and then I say here, this natural inclination of certain men to have higher proclivity to be attuned to one's nature and the related capacity to direct and control it is obviously in contradiction with Nietzsche. Is obviously non-contradictory with Nietzsche. I was like, that doesn't make sense. Good. But we do not maintain now that such a man has whatever he pleases to do with those over whom he lords. There is a necessary reciprocal relationship on the basis of this equivalence. Does this constrain his course of action? Yes. But if he believes he is to take a course of action which is against the will of the people, it is his duty and onus to convince them of this fact. Right? So there has to be a type of respect for the responsibility he bears by virtue of this higher nature that he bears. And I think that a very good example of this is Kennedy's speech at American University in 1963, where he tries to convince the American people we should not try to take more arms in the context of the Cold War. We should not try to vilify the Russians. The Russians themselves have borne a great deal of sacrifice in the context of World War II. Their lives were taken from them. Their houses were taken from them. So much was taken from them, and they have sacrificed so much. And it would be better for us to have compassion and understanding for why they might be on edge. So let us go forward together peaceably, rather than to be at each other's throats. Yes, and I think that from a truly American point of view, if one truly understands the values and virtues of what forms the basis of an American man, then one observes that if he is endowed with this sacred power, that it is his duty to do something like this, right? But of course, one realizes immediately what one is fighting against. I mean, there has been a great deal of degradation of our system as a consequence of neglect on this basis. So, but I don't think that it means that we give up on it. I don't think we need to be cynical about it. I think that the sort of things that we're speaking about are, well, when I say that they're transcendental, I mean, I do think that they are timeless. And as a consequence of that, I think that there's something about them that resonate with all people. And I think that should be our ideal. The purpose of an ideal is to orient you. It's to make it so that you can judge whether or not you're becoming better. The fact that one never achieves his ideal doesn't mean that one throws his hands up in the air and says, well, we shouldn't have any ideals. Yes, and so I've gone through this argument to show that equality is derived from a transcendental principle. It's something prior to the realization of a social system, even if one needs to be in the social context in order to realize the idea. And I'm not saying that that's necessarily true. I'm saying that if it is the case, yes, if it is the case that one realizes it in the social context, it doesn't necessarily imply that it's socially derived. Yeah. I go off on a slight tangent about the notion of a law as well, but I think for the sake of time, I'm actually going to skip that discussion. Yes, and so finally what I want to say is, even if it is the case that democracy gives rise to authoritarianism, I think that we should be much more vehement in the West to assert that what the sort of government that we actually have here is not a democracy. It drives me absolutely crazy when people say, our democracy, this democracy, 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 I'm pro-democracy, blah, blah, blah. Okay, well, if you're pro-democracy or you're pro this democracy or you love our democracy or whatever, then what you love is this bizarre type of collectivism that facilitates projection of the shadow, facilitates scapegoating, and will always degenerate and degrade into something that is absolutely unsalvageable, which is why I'm so vehement on saying we don't have a democracy, we have a republic. Now, there's been the republic has taken a lot of hits, and we look more like a democracy than we ever have, but it doesn't mean that we necessarily have a democracy. And I think that the more people cling to this meme that we are a democracy, the more it will become an inevitability, and the more we are likely to see this dissolution into an absolute authoritarianism. Yes. Now, when the individuals who formed this government, the American government, were working on what sort of government we ought to have, their idea was always one should have a balanced government. That in reality, the best type of government is actually balanced between democracy and oligarchy and a monarchy, which is actually why we have a president, and in principle the Senate was supposed to serve as the more aristocratic branch, but of course that's been undermined as a consequence of one of our amendments. Just to really hammer this point home, let me quote from John Adams in his defense of the United States Constitution, chapter 11. He says here, the aristocracy, or he's quoting from Plato, and just adding his own words here. The aristocracy or ambitious republic becomes immediately an oligarchy. What shall be done to prevent it? Place two guardians of the laws to watch the aristocracy, one in the shape of a king on the one side of it, another in the shape of a democratic assembly on the other side. The aristocracy becomes an oligarchy, changes into a democracy. How shall it be prevented? By giving the natural aristocracy in society the rational and just weight, and by giving it a regal power to appeal to against the madness of the people. Democracy becomes a tyranny. How shall this be prevented? By giving it an able independent ally in an aristocratical assembly, with whom it may unite against the unjust and illegal designs of one man. It was never in the intention of these men to form a purely democratic structure. There was always this notion of we need to have balance. We need to take all aspects of all governmental structures which have existed. Now, on the basis of this equality, there is no rulership except for by the consent of the people. In other words, one must sacrifice up a little bit of what one has in order to participate in society. This is the notion, for example, of the social contract in the context of Hobbes' Leviathan. You can go and read that if you want. But it was never meant to be a pure democracy on the basis of this degradation into tyranny, which NH outlines. Yes, and so I say here, one does not dissolve hierarchy. One does not dissolve hierarchy by the introduction of an a priori equivalence. We cannot therefore make the degeneration we now observe contingent upon equality per se. Harkening back to the first question, one of the questions that I asked at the beginning of the video. Rather, the current image of the concept of equality betrays this decay. In other words, this naive equality that's based on materialistic metrics betrays this pathologization. It reveals this pathologization. One must not mistake effects for causes, to quote Nietzsche. The reason I mention this is because one can have a concept of equality as a foundational principle and yet still preserve hierarchy, as I've consistently stated in this video over and over and over again. In our view here, it is the decay of order as such which causes the decay of core concepts. Thus, we do not trace the downfall and inevitability of we do not trace the downfall in inevitable authoritarianism to the notion of equality, but to the decay of the notion of equality. This decay, we postulate, is far more elementary in the strata of the human psyche. It seems to be the action of the shadow itself. If you go and you read Jordan Peterson's Maps of Meaning, he shows quite clearly, in my view, how this decay can manifest itself in other structures. How this, if one has too rigid of a structure, how that can naturally decay into a devouring structure, which inevitably gives rise to populistic responses. In this case, we just have a more feminine, dominant type of decay, where everything is homogenized entirely, right? This is like, in its most extreme form, even remove boundaries. Like there should be no, like pure equality means there should be no difference between us and nature. There should be no difference between us and animals. There should be no difference between us and atoms, and everything has emotions. And you project like a type of humanity into literally everything. But this isn't the type of equality we're talking about here. We're talking about something strictly different. So then I ask, as a sort of solution to all of this, what do we do in the face of this decay? If we believe, for example, with Neumann in his Depth Psychology and a New Ethic, that this degradation is really due to the shadow, then what it means is we have to withdraw our projection of the shadow. In other words, we need to understand about ourselves what it is we regard to be evil. And we need to realize that it's coming from within us in some sense. That what I regard to be evil really does have something to do with me, not just with the other guy over there. And in some sense, I have to integrate this fact. I have to realize that this is a true part of me and that I am more than just that thing. Because otherwise we're going to be beholden to these things. We'll inevitably end up making decisions on the basis of this type of projection where we scapegoat people, where we say it's all your fault, or you end up identifying with the shadow and just saying, screw it. If I'm going to be called this, that, or the other thing, I might as well become this, that, or the other thing. So, and I don't think that that's an easy task, but I do think that it's really the only thing that's going to resolve the problem. This is the process of individuation, by the way, and there are many resources on that. You can see, for example, Jung's theories in Collected Works 9. Neumann articulates this quite nicely in his Origins and History of Consciousness. Also, the Depth Psychology and the New Ethic, you can look there too. And probably Jordan Peterson talks about these sorts of things. There are probably other individuals who speak about it. I would say that it's even implicit in, say, for example, Nietzsche's work too. Like this idea of to become strong, to become an individual. Although Nietzsche relies, I think, more on a type of suppression, more on a type of creation of one's own values, which I don't think is necessarily possible insofar as one has structure to the psyche prior to his existence. Yeah, and I say here this. Jung shows that this decay, and Mysterium oh my God, I'm so bad at saying this. Mysterium Conjunctionis, Collected Works 14. Jung shows that the decay always forms the seedbed of new life in that work. In particular, his Psychology and Alchemy and Collected Works 14 show this fact very clearly. The decay indicates that the underlying animating principle has ceased to function properly. Its death signifies that the species of experiences to which it encodes adaptation are too far removed from current experience. In other words, the way that we experience things now and the memes we've been given, the memes need to be updated, basically. Not the transcendental aspect, but the transient aspect of the thing, right? So like to say all men are created equal needs to be rephrased in a way that is relevant to how we speak about it today. But it doesn't mean that the underlying transcendental content has been nullified. This withdrawal and individuation process leverages the individual's nature to rebuild these images as adapted to the individual. From there, successful memes propagate outward. In other words, you become the testing ground for new memes. It's just like with genetics. You'll have one sort of molecule try out a type of structure that gives rise to a type of being. That being is either maladapted or pro-adapted to his reality. And the more pro-adapted individual one is, the more likely his genetics are to propagate. Right? In this case, we're speaking about psychological genetics, which we refer to as memetics. Although, of course, Dawkins sees these things as components to cultural phenomena, but we're basically getting down to semantics in terms of the difference. It's my view that only a free governing structure built on the principle of the people by the people for the people, which generates this, which can guarantee this. Yeah. Because in order to be able to do this, one must be sufficiently free to experiment with his ideas. And this self-censoring that people have to go through these days is so it's bad for our psychological cleanliness. It's bad for our mental diet, right? It's like, imagine all you eat is hot dogs all day long for 30 years. You're going to have a really horrible digestive system. It's the exact same thing, this self-censoring. It's like this idea, the idea of free expression is required so that one can experiment with who he is. The reason that we have laws is to impose some constraint on that. But the nature of this constraint is just so that one doesn't venture into experimentation with structures that are overly destructive, for example, murder. But the more that we view our social structure, our cultural structure, as something that we're supposed to micromanage, the less we can surrender to this natural process of individuation, which has characterized all of humanity since we've come into being. And what we're giving up, I think, is something, it's like a natural function of who we are. We're giving that up because we believe we can do better than that. And, if you start to scrutinize that a little bit more carefully, you start to realize that that's very, very absurd. That it's absolutely absurd to suppose that that's the case. And maybe I'll make a video on that too at some point. But yeah, so these are essentially my thoughts on this. The main piece that I wanted to get across was that this notion of equality shouldn't be taken in a naive sense. And that I don't think that, receding into yourself in an individualistic fashion without feeling any sort of responsibility for the collective is a good answer. It's an understandable answer, but I don't think it's a good one. And I also understand the cynicism of there's nothing we can do. There's nothing that can be done. And I don't have any good answer for that right now. But I do think that if you are sufficiently aware of what you are, of who you are, then there is some kind of responsibility to help the people around you to become all that they can be too. And I don't think that has anything to do with me trying to force myself on other people. I think it has something much more to do with, I don't know, being a conduit for God in a way that He can work through me, and then other people can see me as a sort of lighthouse, you know. And what that means requires a lot of discussion too, but this is the basis of the intuition, I think. So I hope you got something out of this, if you made it this far in the video, and I hope this was useful, and I'm interested to hear your thoughts. And if you feel like this is useful, please share this around. Feel free to subscribe to me. I'm in graduate school, so I can't make any promises about how many videos I'll be making. I want to start to be more disciplined about that, but we'll see what happens. I have a lot of things on my plate already. Anyways, yeah, take care.